When Ethan's family called me a gold digger for the first time, they did it with a smile, a dinner table, and the kind of politeness that makes you doubt your own reaction. At the time, I didn't know that moment would quietly decide the next several years of my life, or that everything they were about to put me through would later be justified as a test I was never warned about. I met Ethan's family 6 months into our relationship, and even then something about the timing felt controlled. He always had a reason for delaying it, saying his parents were traditional, cautious, and slow to trust, especially when it came to the women he dated, and because I loved him, I chose to believe that meant they were protective rather than judgmental. The invitation finally came as a formal dinner at his parents' house just outside the city. The place was large and quiet, expensive without being flashy, and the moment I stepped inside, I felt like I was being observed rather than welcomed. His mother greeted Ethan warmly, hugging him with genuine affection, but when she turned to me, her smile shifted into something polite and distant. Instead of using my name, she asked Ethan if I was the woman he had mentioned, as if I were a topic rather than a person. Dinner moved slowly, filled with questions about my job, my background, and my plans for the future. Each answer I gave was followed by a pause or a glance exchanged across the table, moments that made it clear my words were being weighed rather than simply heard. Halfway through the meal, his mother laughed softly and mentioned that Ethan had dated women before who were very interested in the lifestyle his family could provide. She said it lightly, almost jokingly, but her eyes stayed on me, watching carefully for a reaction. She followed it by saying they had learned to be careful over the years, emphasizing the word just enough to make it clear that this caution was aimed directly at me. I stayed calm, smiled politely, and reminded myself that reacting emotionally would only confirm assumptions I hadn't been given the chance to address. The tension sharpened when dessert arrived, and Ethan's sister finally looked directly at me. Without hesitation, she asked whether I was with him for love or for what he would eventually inherit, and the silence that followed felt deliberate rather than awkward. Ethan laughed nervously and tried to brush it off as a joke, but no one else joined him. Instead of defending myself aggressively, I said calmly that I had my own career, my own goals, and a life I had built long before I met their son. His mother nodded slowly and said independence was a good quality to have, though her tone sounded less like approval and more like confirmation. On the drive home, Ethan apologized repeatedly and promised things would get better, and I believed him, not realizing that this dinner had never been about getting to know me, but about quietly deciding what they thought I was. After that dinner, things didn't explode the way I half expected them to, and instead everything became quieter, subtler, wrapped in politeness that felt heavier than open hostility. Ethan told me his family had decided to give me a chance, framing it as generosity rather than judgment, and I remember feeling relieved even though something about that phrasing unsettled me. Not long after, his mother started inviting me to things that sounded harmless on the surface: lunches, charity events, small family gatherings where I was always included but never fully welcomed. Every invitation came with an unspoken expectation, and I quickly realized that these weren't social gestures, but opportunities to observe how I behaved when money, comfort, and status were placed within reach. At one lunch, his mother casually mentioned a vacation home the family owned, describing it in detail while watching my face closely, as if waiting for excitement or envy to slip through. I listened politely, asked no questions, and changed the subject, which seemed to satisfy her, though the look she exchanged with Ethan's sister told me this reaction had been noted. Ethan began to explain their behavior in private, telling me his family believed in testing people before trusting them fully, especially partners who might one day benefit from their wealth. He said it like it was normal, like something everyone did, and when I told him it made me uncomfortable, he reassured me that it was temporary and that once I passed, things would be easier. The tests became more personal over time, showing up as small, uncomfortable situations designed to see what I would tolerate or ask for. His father once offered to help me financially during a rough month, presenting it as concern, and when I declined politely and said I would manage on my own, the relief on his face felt less kind and more calculated. At another family gathering, Ethan's sister made a point of mentioning how expensive everything was: the food, the house, the artwork on the walls, and then asked me what I thought about living like that long term. I told her honestly that comfort was nice, but independence mattered more to me, and while she smiled, I noticed how quickly she relayed my answer to their mother. What bothered me most wasn't the questions themselves, but the way Ethan started to echo them without realizing it. He would ask whether I was happy with simple things, whether I ever felt limited by my income, or whether I expected a certain lifestyle in the future, and each question felt less like curiosity and more like a quiet checkmark on someone else's list. I told myself I was overthinking it, that families with money were naturally cautious, and that love meant patience even when things felt unfair. Still, a small part of me began to wonder what would happen if I ever failed one of these invisible tests, and whether Ethan would stand beside me or silently step back like the rest of them. By the end of that year, I realized that nothing I did was neutral anymore, because every choice, every refusal, and every boundary was being interpreted as evidence for or against a story they had already written about me. What I didn't yet understand was that passing their test didn't mean earning trust, but proving how much I was willing to endure without asking for anything in return. The tests stopped feeling subtle the moment they asked me to give something up, because until then everything had been about what I wouldn't take, rather than what I was willing to lose. It started with a suggestion that sounded reasonable, framed as concern, and delivered with the same polite tone they always used when they wanted to see how far I would bend without breaking. I had just been offered a promotion that would require relocating for a year. Nothing permanent, just an opportunity that would advance my career and give me some independence I had worked hard for. When Ethan mentioned it to his parents, their reaction wasn't anger or disapproval, but disappointment disguised as practicality, with his mother saying it would be a shame if I prioritized work over family so early in a serious relationship. Not long after that, his father asked if I would consider staying closer, pointing out how important stability was to them and how disruptive long distance could be for Ethan. The conversation felt less like advice and more like a negotiation where the outcome had already been decided, and when I hesitated, Ethan stepped in and said we could make it work if I stayed, his voice calm but his eyes avoiding mine. I told myself relationships require compromise, and that one postponed opportunity didn't define my future, so I turned the promotion down. When I shared that decision, his family reacted with quiet approval, nods exchanged across the room, and a warmth I hadn't felt from them before, which made it painfully clear that I had just passed something important. After that, the expectations became heavier and harder to ignore, showing up as unpaid favors and emotional labor that slowly took over my time. His mother began relying on me to help organize family events, manage details she said she was too tired to handle, and show up whenever she needed support, all while reminding me how lucky I was to be included. Ethan noticed the strain but never challenged it, choosing instead to thank me for being understanding and telling me how much his parents appreciated my effort. Each time I tried to set a boundary, he gently redirected the conversation, reminding me that this was temporary and that once they trusted me fully, things would change. The moment that stayed with me most came during a family gathering when his sister joked about how I was practically part of the household already, considering how much I helped without ever asking for anything in return. Everyone laughed and I forced a smile, realizing that what they admired wasn't my character, but my silence. By then, I understood the real purpose of the test, which had nothing to do with money and everything to do with control. They weren't measuring whether I wanted what they had, but whether I would give up pieces of myself to prove I didn't, and whether I would do it quietly enough to keep the peace. What I didn't yet know was that someone had been watching all of this much more closely than I realized, documenting every sacrifice, every refusal, and every moment I chose dignity over comfort. And while I believed I was slowly disappearing to earn acceptance, the truth was that my restraint was becoming evidence in a decision that would eventually change everything. The shift came quietly, the way all the most destabilizing moments in my life seemed to, without warning or drama, just a phone call on an ordinary afternoon that left everything afterward feeling unreal. Ethan told me his grandfather had been hospitalized suddenly, and although I had met the man only a handful of times, the urgency in his voice made it clear this was not something the family expected him to recover from. His grandfather had always been different from the rest of them, quieter, sharper, and far more observant, the kind of person who spoke rarely but noticed everything. When we visited him in the hospital, he didn't say much, but he looked at me for a long moment, long enough to make me uncomfortable, before simply asking if I was tired, a question no one else in that family had ever asked me sincerely. He passed away 2 weeks later, and the house that once felt controlled and deliberate became heavy with grief and unspoken anxiety. The family moved quickly into logistics and appearances, organizing memorials and legal meetings with the same efficiency they applied to everything else, and I noticed how often conversations stopped when I entered the room, as if I were suddenly irrelevant again. Ethan became distant during that time, emotionally present but careful, as though he were waiting for instructions he hadn't yet received. His mother stopped inviting me to help with anything, his sister barely acknowledged me, and the warmth I had earned through sacrifice seemed to vanish overnight, replaced by a polite neutrality that felt worse than suspicion. When the family gathered for the reading of the will, I wasn't sure why I was even invited, assuming it was out of courtesy rather than necessity. I sat quietly at the edge of the room, telling myself I didn't belong there, that whatever was about to happen had nothing to do with me, and that once it was over, things would return to whatever version of normal we had been living. The lawyer began reading through the will methodically, naming properties, accounts, and personal items, all divided among family members in ways that seemed expected. I watched Ethan's sister straighten in her chair and his mother nod along calmly, as though they already knew exactly how this would end. Then my name was read out loud. At first, I thought I had misheard it, convinced it was a mistake or a formality I didn't understand. But when the lawyer repeated it, the room shifted in a way I had never experienced before. Ethan turned toward me with confusion on his face. His mother froze completely, and his sister laughed softly, assuming it was some kind of symbolic gesture. The lawyer continued, explaining that his grandfather had left the majority of his estate, including the house and controlling assets, to me, citing my integrity, restraint, and consistency of character over time. The room went silent, not with grief, but with shock, the kind that strips people of the ability to pretend. Ethan's mother immediately protested, insisting there had to be conditions, limitations, or misunderstandings, while his sister demanded to know why an outsider would be trusted over family. The lawyer calmly clarified that the decision was intentional, final, and made while his grandfather was of sound mind, and that there were no stipulations attached. I sat there numb, not feeling victorious or relieved, but stunned by the realization that while I believed I was being tested by the family, someone else had been watching with a completely different measure. What I didn't yet understand was how quickly that inheritance would turn from a reward into a weapon, and how violently the people who once tested my silence would react when control was taken away from them. The days after the will was read were quieter than I expected, not because the family accepted what had happened, but because they were regrouping. Ethan's mother stopped calling entirely. His sister began spreading concern disguised as sympathy, and Ethan himself became distant in a way that felt careful rather than confused, as if he were waiting to see which side would benefit him most. The lawyer contacted me privately to explain the details, telling me that his grandfather had kept meticulous notes, documenting interactions, observations, and reasons for every decision he made. He had written about the dinners, the questions, the offers I declined, the promotion I turned down, and the way I never asked for anything even when it would have been easy to do so. And reading those notes was the first time I understood that my silence had not gone unnoticed. When Ethan finally confronted me, it wasn't with happiness or support, but panic, asking what I planned to do and whether I intended to share the inheritance with the family. He framed it as concern for fairness, but the urgency in his voice made it clear he was thinking about what this meant for him, and when I told him I hadn't decided yet, his disappointment surfaced before he could hide it. His mother reached out shortly after, this time without politeness, accusing me of manipulation and betrayal, insisting I had planned this from the beginning. She said no woman ends up in that position by accident, and hearing that made something click for me, because even now, with proof in front of her, she still couldn't imagine a version of me that wasn't calculated. What finally ended everything was a conversation I overheard by accident, when Ethan admitted to his sister that he had always assumed the inheritance would come back to the family eventually, either through marriage or pressure. Hearing my future reduced to a strategy, my loyalty treated as leverage, made the decision clearer than any argument ever could. I didn't argue, I didn't defend myself, and I didn't try to explain anything because for the first time, I didn't need to. I ended the relationship quietly, signed the necessary papers, and stepped away from a family that had spent years testing my character only to fail their own. In the end, I didn't inherit everything because I passed their test, but because I never played their game. And while they spent years trying to decide whether I was worthy of their trust, someone else had already decided they weren't worthy of mine.